The name is Bond. James Bond.
Hello there, James Bond fans. It's Zain here from Zains007Fancast. Today's mission takes us deep into the shadowy world of Cold War espionage as we dive into Ian Fleming's legendary classic, From Russia with Love. Both the novel and the film deliver a gripping tale of deception, danger, and one of the most suspenseful missions in Bond history. So settle in, pour yourself a drink, and join me as we explore the intrigue, tension, and enduring legacy of this remarkable Bond story. From Russia with Love. The story. The novel opens not with James Bond, but inside the secretive Soviet intelligence organization, Smersh, where a carefully calculated plan is being developed to destroy the British agent. Bond has become a persistent problem for Soviet operations, and Smersh decides his death must be turned into a humiliating propaganda victory against the British Secret Service. The mastermind behind the operation is the brilliant but cold strategist, Colonel Kronstein. A former chess champion and master planner within Smersh, Kronstein designs an intricate trap intended not only to kill Bond but to publicly disgrace him. His plan is built on manipulation, psychology, and patience. The scheme centers on Tatiana Romanova, a Soviet cipher clerk who pretends to fall in love with Bond and defect to the West. She offers to deliver a priceless Soviet code-breaking device, the Spectre cipher machine, if Bond personally escorts her to safety. The British intelligence service cannot resist the opportunity. Bond travels to Istanbul to meet Tatiana, assisted by the charismatic Turkish intelligence chief Kerim Bey. Unknown to Bond, however, Kronstein's plan has already placed a killer in his path, the psychopathic Smersh assassin Donald Red Grant, who secretly follows them. Bond and Tatiana attempt to escape aboard the legendary Orient Express. During the journey, Grant finally reveals himself, leading to one of the most famous confrontations in spy fiction. Trapped in a cramped train compartment, Bond must rely on instinct and deception to defeat the assassin and survive the trap Kronstein so carefully constructed. But the mission is not over. The ruthless Smersh operative Rosa Klebb later attacks Bond, using a poisoned blade hidden in her shoe. Bond collapses from the toxin, leaving the novel's ending suspended between life and death. Through Kronstein's calculated plan, Fleming creates a story built on strategy rather than spectacle. The enemy operates through patience, manipulation, and psychological control, turning From Russia with Love into one of the most tense and sophisticated espionage stories ever written. Part 1. Ian Fleming at the Edge. To understand From Russia with Love, you first need to understand the man who wrote it, and the state of mind he was in when he did. By the mid-1950s, Ian Fleming was both triumphant and deeply unsettled. James Bond had become a literary success. The early novels were selling strongly, attracting attention far beyond the typical spy thriller audience. Critics were divided. Some dismissed the books as escapist pulp, while others recognized something darker beneath the glamour. But readers loved them. Bond was becoming a cultural force. And yet Fleming himself was not comfortable. He was living a life defined by contradiction. Outwardly, he had everything he had once wanted: recognition, financial security, and the satisfaction of seeing his imagination embraced by millions. Privately, however, he was exhausted. Years of heavy smoking, drinking, stress, and relentless work were beginning to catch up with him. His health was fragile. He suffered from anxiety about mortality, and the pressure to produce a new Bond novel each year weighed heavily. Fleming wrote quickly, famously completing first drafts during intense bursts of creativity at his Jamaican home, Goldeneye. Each year, he would isolate himself, follow a strict routine, and pour out another adventure. But by the time he reached From Russia with Love, something had shifted. The tone darkened. The fantasy began to crack. Fleming had always insisted that Bond was not a hero in the traditional sense. Bond was, in Fleming's words, a blunt instrument wielded by a government department. He was a professional killer, shaped by war and bureaucracy. And Fleming increasingly wanted to explore the consequences of that reality. The Cold War was not an abstract concept for him. He had worked in British naval intelligence during the Second World War, helping design operations and studying the psychology of espionage. He knew that real intelligence work was rarely glamorous. It involved patience, manipulation, moral compromise, and quiet violence. By the mid-1950s, global tensions were escalating. The Soviet Union and the West were locked in ideological conflict. Nuclear weapons had transformed the stakes of international politics. Spy scandals filled newspapers, double agents, defections, secret trials. These were not fictional devices, but daily realities. Fleming absorbed all of it, and he asked himself a question that would define From Russia with Love. What happens when the enemy decides to destroy not just the man, but the myth? Previous Bond novels had placed Bond in danger, but this time Fleming wanted something different. He wanted inevitability. He wanted readers to feel the trap long before Bond did. Instead of starting with Bond, he began with the villains, a bold and risky narrative decision. It was almost an inversion of the heroic formula. Bond would not enter the story as a triumphant figure. He would walk into it as prey. There is also evidence that Fleming intended this novel to be an ending, or at least a possible ending. His declining health and growing fatigue with the series made him consider killing Bond outright. The closing moments of the book reflect this uncertainty, leaving readers suspended between life and death. In many ways, From Russia with Love represents Fleming confronting his own creation. He strips away some of the glamour. He reduces the scale of the mission. He replaces grand villains with cold bureaucracy. And he places Bond inside a story where victory is never guaranteed. The result is a novel that feels different from what came before. Quieter, more tense, more psychologically precise. It's less about saving the world and more about surviving a carefully constructed trap. And that shift from spectacle to tension is what makes From Russia with Love the moment James Bond becomes truly dangerous. Part 2. Smersh, the banality of evil. Before James Bond enters From Russia with Love, Ian Fleming forces us to sit with the enemy, and this decision changes everything, because instead of beginning with action or glamour, Fleming begins with paperwork, planning, and quiet conversations behind closed doors, the slow machinery of institutional power deciding that one man must disappear. To understand why Fleming structured the novel this way, we need to step into the psychological landscape of the Cold War. The 1950s were defined not just by espionage, but by the fear of invisible systems. Governments had become vast intelligence networks. Information moved faster than ever. Ideology shaped identity, and the greatest terror was no longer a single villain. It was a bureaucracy that could erase you without emotion. This is what Smersh represents. The name itself carries weight. In reality, Smersh was a Soviet counterintelligence organization formed during World War II. Its name derived from the phrase "Smrt špionam," death to spies. While Fleming exaggerated and fictionalized the group for dramatic effect, he grounded it in genuine intelligence history. Readers at the time recognized the name and understood the threat it implied. But Fleming's Smersh is not defined by theatrical cruelty, it is defined by efficiency. The opening sequences read almost like minutes from a meeting. Officers sit, discuss, evaluate. Files are opened, behavior patterns analyzed. Bond becomes a case study, a psychological profile dissected line by line. This is deeply unsettling because it strips away the emotional drama we expect from villains. There is no hatred, no personal vendetta, no obsession. Bond is simply an operational problem, and operational problems require solutions. Fleming understood something essential about intelligence work. The most frightening decisions are often made quietly. No raised voices, no dramatic speeches, just a consensus reached by people who believe they are serving a greater purpose. Colonel Rosa Klebb embodies this philosophy perfectly. She is not glamorous, she is not charming, she is not even particularly charismatic. Instead, she is rigid, unpleasant, and deeply ideological, a woman who has sacrificed humanity in exchange for loyalty to the state. Fleming's portrayal of Klebb reflects a specific Cold War anxiety, the fear that totalitarian systems produce individuals who no longer see other people as human beings, only as tools. Her discussions about Bond are chilling precisely because they are clinical. She studies him like an engineer studying a machine. His history, his habits, his known romantic relationships, his physical preferences, his psychological triggers. And what she concludes is devastatingly simple. Bond is vulnerable because he is human. He enjoys women. He responds to emotional cues. He believes he can read people, and therefore he can be manipulated. This approach reflects real intelligence methods. Both Western and Soviet agencies invested heavily in psychological profiling during the Cold War. Agents were trained to exploit loneliness, vanity, desire, ideology, any emotional opening that could be turned into leverage. Fleming was not inventing fantasy here, he was amplifying reality, and this grounding in real-world espionage gives From Russia with Love its distinctive tone. Unlike later Bond stories filled with world-ending devices, this narrative operates on intimate stakes. The weapon is not a missile or a laser, it is trust. The Spectre decoding machine becomes the perfect bait. In the world of intelligence, information is power. Code-breaking devices were the holy grail of espionage. The idea that a Soviet cipher clerk might defect with such a machine would be irresistible to British intelligence. Fleming understood that intelligence agencies are vulnerable to opportunity. When a prize appears too valuable to ignore, risk becomes secondary. And that is the brilliance of the Smersh plan. They do not attack Bond directly. They create a situation where Bond chooses to walk into danger willingly. The plan weaponizes Western intelligence priorities. It turns Bond's professionalism against him. And perhaps most importantly, it weaponizes romance. Tatiana Romanova is selected not because she is inherently dangerous, but because she appears authentic. She represents the fantasy of defection that defined Cold War narratives. The individual trapped inside an oppressive regime, seeking freedom through the West. But the reader knows something Bond does not. Her role is scripted, her emotions monitored, her choices controlled. This creates a rare storytelling dynamic. Instead of wondering what the villain is planning, we watch the plan unfold in slow motion. We become witnesses to inevitability. Every step forward feels heavier because we understand its consequences. When Bond finally enters the story, confident, calm, professional, he feels almost tragically unaware, and that awareness shifts our relationship with him. Bond is no longer invincible. He is a man walking toward a trap we have already seen constructed. This narrative structure reflects a deeper philosophical shift in Fleming's writing. Earlier Bond novels often placed Bond against larger-than-life antagonists who revealed themselves through spectacle. Here, the enemy hides behind paperwork, behind meetings, behind ideology. The true antagonist is not just Rosa Klebb, it is the system itself. And systems do not make mistakes out of ego. They make mistakes only when humans inside them fail. That subtle change makes From Russia with Love darker, more realistic, and more psychologically disturbing than many other Bond stories. Because it suggests something deeply uncomfortable, that even a legendary spy can be reduced to a file on a desk. A target number, a statistical risk, a problem waiting to be solved. Part 3. When Bond enters the story, the hero as prey. One of the boldest structural decisions Ian Fleming ever made in his writing appears almost invisible at first, but once you notice it, you realize how radically it changes the experience of From Russia with Love. James Bond does not begin this story, he arrives late, and that delay transforms him. In earlier novels, Bond is the center of gravity from the opening pages. The reader sees the world through him, his confidence, his competence, his control. Even when danger looms, Bond feels dominant because we inhabit his perspective. But here, Fleming removes that safety. He begins with the enemy. We watch the trap being constructed piece by piece. We know the plan. We understand the risks. And when Bond finally appears, he enters a narrative that already belongs to someone else. This is storytelling designed to destabilize the reader's relationship with the hero, because instead of anticipation, wondering what Bond will do, we feel dread. We know something Bond doesn't, and that knowledge creates tension that runs beneath every interaction. The first glimpse of Bond, routine as character. When Bond finally appears, Fleming does something subtle but powerful. He does not introduce him through action, he introduces him through routine. Bond is in London, he is working, he is receiving instructions, and everything about him feels measured, precise, professional. Fleming lingers on small details, the way Bond dresses, the way he listens, the way he responds to orders. This is Bond as civil servant, a reminder that beneath the myth lies a man who answers to a bureaucracy. And this is important because by showing Bond in routine, Fleming strips away some of the glamour that readers may expect. Bond is not larger than life here. He is efficient, slightly tired, slightly cynical, and crucially, unaware. While the audience has spent chapters watching Smersh analyze and manipulate him, Bond himself believes this is just another mission. That imbalance of knowledge gives the narrative its emotional weight. Every decision he makes feels loaded. Every confident step forward feels like movement deeper into danger. M and the structure of authority. Bond's briefing with M takes on new meaning when viewed through this lens. Normally, these scenes serve as exposition, the mission setup before adventure begins. But in From Russia with Love, they carry an undercurrent of vulnerability. M represents British authority, calm, rational, pragmatic. Yet even M is operating without full information. The potential defection of Tatiana Romanova and the offer of the Spectre decoding machine appear too valuable to ignore. This reflects a real intelligence dilemma. Agencies must balance skepticism with opportunity, reject too many risks and you miss breakthroughs, accept too many and you walk into traps. Fleming understood this balance deeply. He portrays MI6 not as foolish, but as strategically optimistic. They know the risks, but the reward is extraordinary. And so Bond is sent, not because anyone believes it will be easy, but because intelligence work often demands stepping into uncertainty. Istanbul as threshold, entering the liminal world. Bond's journey to Istanbul represents more than a change of location. It marks the crossing from safety into ambiguity. Istanbul in the 1950s was one of the most important espionage crossroads in the world, positioned between Europe and Asia, between NATO influence and Soviet proximity. It functioned as a real-life playground for spies, informants, double agents, and defectors. Fleming knew this, and he uses the city not simply as exotic scenery, but as a psychological environment. Nothing in Istanbul feels stable. Everyone is watching someone. Alliances shift. Information circulates like currency. The city becomes a liminal space, neither fully east nor fully west, reflecting Bond's own uncertain position within the story. He believes he is entering as hunter, but we know he is entering as prey. Kerim Bey, the human face of espionage. One of the most important elements of this section is Bond's relationship with Kerim Bey. Kerim represents something rare in the Bond universe: warmth. He laughs, he tells stories, he connects emotionally, and through him we see a different style of espionage, one grounded not only in professionalism but in personal loyalty. Kerim understands Istanbul in ways Bond does not. He moves through its hidden spaces effortlessly, guiding Bond through underground networks and secret passages that feel almost mythic. But beyond his operational value, Kerim serves another narrative function. He humanizes Bond. Their conversations allow Bond to relax slightly, to reveal flashes of humor and companionship that are often hidden beneath his professional mask. And this matters deeply because Fleming uses Kerim's presence to build emotional stakes. When danger eventually strikes, it will not feel abstract, it will feel personal. The reader's burden, knowing too much. Perhaps the most fascinating aspect of this section is how Fleming manipulates reader psychology. Because we already know the trap, every friendly gesture feels suspicious, every success feels temporary, every moment of calm feels fragile. Bond's confidence becomes almost tragic. We are watching a man perform competence inside a situation that has already been engineered against him. This is rare in adventure fiction. Instead of identifying fully with Bond's perspective, we become observers, witnesses to an unfolding inevitability. And that shift makes From Russia with Love feel darker, more mature, more psychologically complex than many other Bond stories. The hero transformed. By delaying Bond's entrance, Fleming accomplishes something profound. He changes who Bond is. Bond is no longer simply the agent who controls the narrative. He becomes a figure moving through a world shaped by others. He becomes vulnerable, human, fallible, and that vulnerability is what makes the later confrontation on the train, in the confined space between trust and betrayal, feel inevitable rather than surprising. Because by the time Bond boards the Orient Express, we already understand the truth. The mission was never about success, it was about survival. Part 4. Istanbul, the city where spies disappear. When James Bond arrives in Istanbul, the tone of From Russia with Love shifts again. The story stops feeling like a briefing and starts feeling like immersion. Because Istanbul is not simply a location in this novel, it is an atmosphere, a living organism shaped by history, geography, and secrecy. Fleming understood something fundamental about espionage. Spies thrive in cities that exist between worlds, and few cities in history have embodied that threshold more completely than Istanbul. For centuries, the city had stood at the crossroads of empires: Roman, Byzantine, Ottoman. By the mid-20th century, it had become something else entirely, a frontier between ideological realities. On one side, the expanding influence of NATO and Western alliances, on the other, the looming presence of the Soviet Union, and in between, diplomats, informants, smugglers, defectors, intelligence officers, and people who claimed to be none of those things. Real spies operated here. Real secrets moved through its cafes and consulates, and Fleming knew it. The real Istanbul of the Cold War. During the early Cold War, Istanbul functioned as one of the world's most important intelligence crossroads. The proximity to Soviet territories meant embassies became observation posts, hotels were monitored, telephone lines were suspected of being tapped, conversations took place in code, or not at all. Western intelligence agencies viewed Istanbul as both opportunity and danger. It was a place where agents could meet without immediately raising suspicion, where defectors might slip across ideological lines, and where information could be exchanged in ways that felt almost theatrical. Fleming had visited Istanbul himself during his career, and his descriptions carry the texture of lived experience. He captures the mixture of glamour and unease, the sense that beneath every beautiful view lies a network of invisible watchers. Bond stepping into Istanbul is therefore more than narrative progression. It is entry into a world where certainty dissolves. Kerim Bey, Guide Through the Shadow City. Kerim Bey emerges as one of the most significant characters in this section, not just as Bond's ally, but as our guide into the layered reality of espionage. Unlike Bond, who approaches missions with cool professionalism, Kerim operates through relationships. He understands the city not as a map, but as a network of human connections, favors owed, loyalties earned, secrets traded. Through Kerim, Fleming introduces one of the novel's most fascinating themes: intelligence work as lived experience rather than abstract strategy. Kerim knows the streets, he knows who is watching whom, he knows when danger is approaching before anyone says a word, and most importantly, he understands that survival in a city like Istanbul depends on intuition as much as training. Their partnership reveals another dimension of Bond's character. Around Kerim, Bond relaxes slightly. He laughs, he listens, he allows himself to become less isolated. These moments of companionship give depth to Bond that is sometimes absent in other stories. But they also serve a narrative purpose, because Fleming is preparing us emotionally. The more human Bond becomes, the more painful the inevitable losses will feel. The underground, literal and symbolic. One of the most memorable sequences in this section involves the underground passages beneath Istanbul, tunnels, hidden observation points, secret vantage positions from which enemies can be watched without being seen. These locations function on multiple levels. Literally, they demonstrate the ingenuity of espionage. the hidden infrastructure that allows intelligence operations to function unseen. Symbolically, they represent the nature of Cold War conflict itself, a war fought below the surface, invisible to ordinary people but shaping the world above. Fleming uses these spaces to heighten paranoia. Bond is never entirely sure who is watching. Even moments that appear safe carry an undercurrent of danger, and the reader, already aware of the trap constructed by Smersh, experiences these scenes with heightened anxiety. Every movement feels monitored, every shadow feels intentional. Tatiana, desire as strategy. Bond's interactions with Tatiana Romanova begin within this charged atmosphere. She appears exactly as the trap intended, vulnerable, sincere, almost naive. Her desire for escape seems genuine. Her admiration for Bond appears authentic, and here is where Fleming's genius reveals itself. Because even though we know the plan behind her, Tatiana herself does not feel artificial. She feels human. She believes in the fantasy she has been given, that Bond represents freedom, that leaving the Soviet world might offer her a new identity. This creates emotional complexity. Bond sees a potential ally. MI6 sees a potential intelligence prize. Smersh sees a weapon. And the reader sees a young woman caught between forces larger than herself. Istanbul as a character. Perhaps the most important function of Istanbul in From Russia with Love is psychological. The city destabilizes certainty. Unlike London, which represents order and hierarchy, Istanbul represents ambiguity. East and West blur together, truth and deception overlap, and Bond begins to operate in an environment where clear distinctions disappear. The approach to the train. By the time Bond prepares to leave Istanbul, the emotional groundwork has been laid. He believes he has succeeded. He believes he has gained Tatiana's trust. He believes he is returning home with a prize that will reshape intelligence operations. But the reader knows something else. The trap is almost complete, and the train, that confined, inevitable journey through Europe, is waiting. Part 5. The Orient Express, Death in Motion. If Istanbul is the threshold of danger, then the Orient Express is its inevitable conclusion. Everything in From Russia with Love has been building toward this moment. The trap has been set, the players positioned, and now Bond steps onto a train that cannot change direction. The choice of the Orient Express is not accidental. Fleming understood the symbolic power of trains in storytelling. They represent movement without escape, forward motion without control. Once aboard, you are committed to the journey. Doors close, tracks dictate destiny, and in the Cold War imagination, the train becomes something more, a corridor between worlds, a moving border where allegiances shift and identities blur. The Real Orient Express, Myth and History. By the time Fleming wrote the novel, the Orient Express had already achieved legendary status. It was associated with luxury, intrigue, international travel, and mystery. Writers and filmmakers had long used trains as spaces where strangers meet under artificial intimacy, where secrets feel amplified by proximity. But Fleming strips away some of that romanticism. Yes, the train carries elegance, polished wood, quiet service, refined passengers, but beneath the surface lies tension. Compartment doors lock, corridors narrow. Windows frame landscapes that move too quickly to hold on to. And inside this moving world, Bond begins to feel something he rarely admits: unease. The shift in tone, from expansion to confinement. Earlier sections of the story take place across open environments, cities, offices, underground passages. The train changes everything. The world contracts, space becomes limited, movement becomes visible. Every glance is noticed, every sound carries. Fleming uses this spatial restriction to heighten psychological pressure. There are no wide escapes here, no sudden disappearances into crowds. Every character exists within measurable distance, and that means danger cannot be avoided, only delayed. Red Grant, the perfect predator. Enter Donald Red Grant, perhaps one of the most terrifying antagonists Fleming ever created. Grant is not flamboyant, he does not deliver speeches, he does not crave attention. He is patient, professional, and frighteningly calm. Fleming introduces Grant long before the confrontation, allowing readers to understand him as an equal opposite to Bond. Both are highly trained killers, both operate through discipline, both possess emotional detachment necessary for their work. But where Bond maintains a sense of moral alignment, however ambiguous, Grant exists without internal conflict. He kills because he is instructed to kill. He lies because it is efficient. He waits because patience ensures success. Grant's disguise as a British agent is a masterstroke within the narrative. By presenting himself as an ally, he bypasses Bond's defensive instincts. Trust becomes the weapon. And here, Fleming explores one of espionage's deepest fears, the enemy who looks exactly like you. Although sharing some similarities with his film counterpart, there is much more of a backstory to the literary version of Grant. He is described as blonde with tightly curled hair and pale blue eyes. He is also an asexual, has a high pain tolerance and advanced manic depression that coincides with the full moon. Donovan Grant was born in the border village of Ornacloy in Northern Ireland. His birth followed a brief encounter between a waitress from the Irish Free State and a German professional weightlifter who had been performing at a circus near Belfast. Soon after his birth in 1927, his mother died from puerperal fever, leaving behind a request that the child be named Donovan after his father's stage persona, the mighty O'Donovan. With no parents to raise him, Grant was taken in reluctantly by his aunt. As he grew, he became physically powerful but emotionally withdrawn. He rarely spoke to other children and often used his strength to take whatever he wanted. As a result, he became both feared and unpopular among his peers. In his teenage years, Grant's reputation for strength spread through his participation in boxing and wrestling matches at local fairs. After leaving school, he drifted into a rougher world, working as hired muscle for Irish Republican factions and for smuggling operations along the border. From a young age, Red Grant displayed deeply disturbing impulses toward violence, particularly during the time of the full moon. When he was 16, these urges first manifested in the killing of a cat, an act he used to relieve the strange compulsion he felt building inside him. At first, his violence was directed at animals, but it soon escalated. Before long, it culminated in the murder of a sleeping tramp. After that, Grant developed a grim routine. Each month he would cycle to distant villages in search of victims, careful to avoid suspicion. By the time he reached 17, a series of unexplained killings had spread fear across the region. Locals began forming vigilante groups, and additional police forces were brought in to investigate the so-called Moon Killer. Despite several encounters with the authorities, Grant managed to avoid capture. When questioned about his presence on the roads at unusual hours, he calmly explained that he was cycling long distances as part of his training as a boxer. The explanation was convincing enough to deflect suspicion. Eventually, Grant left the area for Belfast before investigators could link him to the crimes. There, he devoted himself seriously to boxing. After intense training, he achieved a significant milestone, winning the North of Ireland Light Heavyweight Championship in 1945 on the day of his 18th birthday. Soon after his boxing success, Grant was called up for national service and assigned as a driver in the British Army's Royal Corps of Signals. His training period in England had a sobering effect on him. While stationed near Aldershot, he began learning how to suppress the violent urges that troubled him, often retreating into the surrounding woods, where he would calm himself by drinking a bottle of whiskey. Not long after, his transport unit was deployed to Berlin. During his time there, Grant became increasingly fascinated by rumors of Soviet ruthlessness and power. Following a personal disgrace, being caught cheating during a boxing match, his loyalty to Britain weakened. Seizing an opportunity for escape and reinvention, Grant defected to the Soviet Union, taking with him a cache of top-secret documents. As part of a carefully engineered Smersh operation designed to create turmoil within Western intelligence, Grant was selected to carry out a staged murder-suicide involving British agent James Bond and the Soviet cipher clerk Tatiana Romanova. The plan was for Grant to kill both of them aboard the Orient Express, then arrange the scene to appear as though the two had died in a scandalous personal dispute. To reinforce the deception, Grant was instructed to plant a forged blackmail letter supposedly written by Romanova, along with compromising film footage of the pair together at the Crystal Palace Hotel in Istanbul. The scheme's bait, a Soviet Spectre cipher machine, would also be left behind. Unknown to those who discovered it, the device would be rigged with explosives intended to kill any Western cryptography experts who attempted to examine it. Once the mission was complete, Grant was to meet his Smersh handler Rosa Klebb in Paris. From there, he would serve as her driver as they made their return journey to the Soviet Union. The slow build of paranoia. The genius of this section lies not in sudden action but in gradual discomfort. Grant does not immediately reveal himself. Instead, he observes, he learns Bond's rhythms, he mirrors Bond's professionalism. The two men share space, conversation, and silence. For readers, this creates unbearable tension. We know the truth, Bond does not, and every friendly exchange becomes loaded with dread. This narrative device, allowing the audience to possess more knowledge than the protagonist, transforms simple dialogue into psychological warfare. The confrontation, violence without glamour. When Grant finally reveals his identity, the shift is sudden but inevitable. There is no theatrical build-up, no elaborate setting, just a compartment, two men, and the understanding that only one will survive. Fleming writes the fight with brutal realism, no elegance, no choreography, just desperation. Bodies collide, breath fails, pain accumulates. Bond does not win because he is stronger, he wins because he adapts. He lies, he manipulates Grant's expectations. This is crucial to understanding Fleming's version of Bond. He is not a superhero, he is a survivor, and survival often requires deception. Why this scene changed spy fiction. Before From Russia with Love, many spy stories leaned toward adventure fantasy, daring escapes, elaborate villains, dramatic heroics. Fleming changed that. The train fight feels grounded, messy, dangerous. Readers could imagine it happening, and that realism influenced generations of writers and filmmakers. The idea that the most intense action could occur in confined spaces, stripped of spectacle, became a defining feature of modern espionage storytelling. The aftermath, silence after violence. Perhaps the most haunting aspect of the train sequence is what follows. The fight ends, but relief does not arrive. Bond is exhausted, shaken, aware that survival has come at a cost. The train continues moving, indifferent to what has happened inside one small compartment. And this moment encapsulates Fleming's philosophy. Espionage is not heroic triumph, it is endurance. The mission continues even when the body wants to stop. The final turn toward betrayal. With Grant dead, Bond believes the worst has passed. He has survived the obvious danger. He has protected Tatiana. He has secured the mission. But the reader understands something else. The plan was never dependent on a single assassin. The real strike has yet to come. And somewhere ahead, waiting with quiet patience, is Rosa Klebb. Part 6. The Poisoned Ending, when James Bond almost died. By the time the train journey ends, the audience feels a sense of release. Bond has survived the confrontation with Red Grant. The trap, it seems, has failed. The enemy's perfect assassin lies dead, and for a brief moment, the narrative allows us to believe that the danger has passed. This is precisely where Ian Fleming delivers one of the most devastating reversals in the entire Bond canon, because the real ending of From Russia with Love is not about victory, it is about inevitability. False relief, the psychology of safety. Fleming understood reader psychology intimately. After the claustrophobic intensity of the train fight, audiences expect resolution. Adventure stories traditionally reward the hero after surviving the central threat. There is usually a return to stability, a sense that the journey has concluded. Fleming uses that expectation against us. The pacing slows, the tension appears to dissipate. Bond believes the mission is complete. He has the girl, he has the prize, he has survived the assassin. Everything suggests narrative closure, and this illusion of safety makes what follows profoundly shocking. Rosa Klebb returns, the face of the system. Unlike Grant, Rosa Klebb is not dramatic. She does not burst into the scene with theatrical energy. She appears quietly, almost mundanely, and that mundanity is terrifying. Klebb represents something more dangerous than individual violence. She represents persistence. She is the embodiment of institutional revenge, the reminder that systems do not collapse because one component fails. Grant's death does not end the plan. It merely advances it to the next phase. This reflects a deeper Cold War anxiety, the idea that defeating one enemy does not dismantle the machine behind them. Fleming positions Klebb as inevitability itself. She is patient, calculated, unemotional, and she carries a weapon that perfectly reflects her character. The poisoned shoe, humiliation as weapon. The attack itself is almost absurd in its simplicity. A hidden blade concealed within a shoe, coated in poison, small, unremarkable, deadly. There is something profoundly unsettling about this choice. Bond, the sophisticated spy who survives elaborate traps and brutal confrontations, is brought down not by a grand weapon, but by a mundane object. Fleming deliberately removes grandeur from the moment. There is no epic showdown, no dramatic duel, just a sudden strike, quick, efficient, humiliating. And this reflects the philosophy introduced at the beginning of the novel. Smersh did not want Bond simply dead. They wanted him reduced, made vulnerable, killed through deception rather than glory. The collapse, stripping away the myth. When the poison takes hold, Bond does not deliver heroic speeches. He weakens, his body betrays him. His consciousness fades. Fleming describes the physical sensation with unsettling intimacy, the slowing of thought, the loss of control, the creeping certainty that survival may not be possible. And then, the story ends. No rescue, no explanation, no reassurance. Bond collapses. Blackness. Silence. Why Fleming ended it this way? At the time of writing, Fleming was exhausted with the series. His health was deteriorating, and he questioned whether Bond had reached the natural end of his journey. Ending the novel with Bond's apparent death allowed Fleming to explore a radical possibility. What if the spy did not survive? It also aligned with Fleming's deeper worldview. He did not see espionage as heroic fantasy. He saw it as dangerous, morally ambiguous work where death could arrive suddenly and without meaning. By refusing to provide immediate closure, Fleming forced readers to confront that reality. The hero might not win. The story might not end cleanly. Reader reaction, shock, and demand. When readers reached the final pages, the reaction was intense. Was Bond dead? Had the series ended? Letters poured in. Fans demanded answers. Publishers recognized the commercial importance of Bond, and Fleming himself began reconsidering. The ambiguity of the ending became one of the most discussed aspects of the novel, transforming it from simply another adventure into a cultural moment. Bond had become larger than the author's control. Readers refused to let him die. Symbolism, the end of invincibility. Even when later novels revealed Bond's survival, something fundamental had changed. The illusion of invincibility was gone. Bond could be poisoned, overpowered, manipulated. He could fail, and that vulnerability became central to the character's enduring appeal. Unlike superheroes, Bond survives through resilience rather than perfection. He bleeds, he breaks, and sometimes he barely escapes. Transition to the film adaptation. The filmmakers understood the power of this ending, but also recognized its risk. Cinema audiences needed resolution, and so, when From Russia with Love moved to the screen, the tone shifted slightly, maintaining tension while ensuring Bond's survival felt definitive rather than ambiguous, but the emotional core remained. The understanding that Bond is not immune to consequence, that survival is fragile, and that danger does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it arrives quietly, on the tip of a shoe. Part 7. The film adaptation, when James Bond became cinematic reality. By the early 1960s, James Bond was no longer just a literary character. He was becoming a phenomenon. The success of Dr. No in 1962 had proven something important. Audiences wanted Bond on screen, but the film industry still viewed the character cautiously. Spy films had existed before, but nothing quite matched Fleming's blend of realism, sexuality, danger, and dry humor. The producers, Albert R. Broccoli and Harry Saltzman, understood that the second film would define whether Bond became a lasting cinematic franchise or a short-lived curiosity, and their choice of story was deliberate. They selected From Russia with Love not because it was bigger than Dr. No, but because it was sharper, more grounded, more dangerous. Learning from Dr. No, less spectacle, more tension. Many franchises respond to early success by increasing scale. Larger explosions, grander villains, bigger action. But the Bond team made a surprising decision. Instead of expanding outward, they tightened inward. Director Terence Young believed that Bond worked best when audiences believed in him as a real man operating within a believable world. He approached the film almost like a Cold War thriller rather than an adventure fantasy. This meant emphasizing real locations, psychological tension, physical vulnerability, intimate confrontations instead of massive battles. Young's philosophy shaped not only From Russia with Love, but the DNA of the entire early Bond era. Sean Connery, the definitive Bond emerges. If Dr. No introduced Sean Connery as Bond, From Russia with Love perfected him. Connery's performance shifts subtly but significantly. He moves with greater confidence, speaks with quieter authority, carries himself like a professional rather than a newcomer. Terence Young mentored Connery closely, teaching him everything from tailoring and etiquette to how a man of refined danger should move through a room. The goal was not just to play Bond, but to embody him. And audiences responded immediately. Connery's Bond feels grounded. He is charming without being soft, violent without being reckless, seductive without losing control. This balance becomes the blueprint for decades of Bond portrayals. The creation of Spectre, politics and storytelling. One of the most significant changes from novel to film involves the villains. In the book, Smersh is explicitly Soviet, but during the height of the Cold War, filmmakers worried that directly portraying Soviet intelligence as the primary antagonist might limit the film's international appeal. The solution was ingenious. They created Spectre, a fictional criminal organization operating outside traditional political boundaries. Spectre allowed the film to maintain geopolitical tension without aligning fully with real-world conflict. This single decision reshaped the entire Bond franchise. Future films would rely on Spectre as a recurring enemy, transforming Bond from a purely Cold War spy into a global agent capable of confronting threats beyond ideology. Visual style, cinematic realism. Unlike later Bond films known for extravagance, From Russia with Love emphasizes realism. Cinematography focuses on shadows, reflections, and quiet observation. Scenes unfold slowly, allowing tension to build naturally. Locations feel lived in rather than stylized. Istanbul is not presented as exotic fantasy, but as a functioning city filled with hidden danger. The train sequences are filmed with careful attention to space and movement, reinforcing claustrophobia rather than spectacle. Even the gadgets remain minimal. Bond's equipment exists, but it does not dominate the narrative. The emphasis remains on skill, on psychology, on survival. The supporting cast, building the world. The film introduces characters who become iconic in their own right. Pedro Armendáriz's Karim Bey brings warmth and humanity, mirroring the novel's emotional core. His presence provides contrast to Bond's restraint and adds emotional weight to the mission. Lotte Lenya's Rosa Klebb translates the novel's unsettling bureaucratic villain into cinematic form. Controlled, cold, quietly menacing. And Robert Shaw's portrayal of Red Grant elevates the character into one of cinema's most memorable antagonists. Shaw plays Grant with chilling restraint, creating a mirror image of Bond that feels almost predatory. Together, these performances create a world where danger feels constant but understated. The train fight, cinema redefined. The confrontation between Bond and Grant on film becomes legendary. Unlike many action scenes of the era, it avoids musical scoring during the fight, allowing every sound, every breath, every impact to feel raw and immediate. The choreography emphasizes struggle rather than grace. The fight feels messy, desperate, real. Audiences were shocked by its intensity, and filmmakers took notice. Decades later, modern spy films continue to reference this scene as a benchmark for grounded action. Tone and legacy. The definitive Bond formula. By the time From Russia with Love reached audiences in 1963, something remarkable had happened. Bond had evolved from literary experiment into cinematic archetype. The film balanced glamour and realism, humor and danger, romance and brutality, and in doing so it established a formula that would sustain the franchise for generations. Many fans and critics still consider it the purest Bond film, a story where espionage feels plausible, where stakes remain personal, and where tension arises from character rather than spectacle. Transition toward legend. But perhaps the most important legacy of From Russia with Love lies in what came next. Because its success gave the filmmakers confidence to expand, to experiment, to introduce larger villains, bigger set pieces, and increasingly ambitious storytelling. Without the grounded success of this film, there might never have been Goldfinger, and without Goldfinger, James Bond might never have become the cultural legend we know today. Part 8. The moment spy fiction changed. How From Russia with Love created the modern spy genre. By the time From Russia with Love reached audiences, first as a novel, then as a film, something subtle but profound had shifted within the world of espionage storytelling. Spy fiction existed long before James Bond, but Bond, and specifically this story, changed what audiences believed a spy narrative could feel like. Because instead of presenting espionage as heroic adventure alone, From Russia with Love introduced a new tone, controlled realism, psychological tension, and danger grounded in human vulnerability rather than fantasy spectacle. Before Bond, spies as gentlemen adventurers. The earliest examples of spy films are vague as nothing much remains beyond their titles. Execution of the Spanish Spy, 1898, and Execution of a Spy, 1900, are noted as the earliest, followed by The Female Spy, 1906. One of the most elaborate surviving films is a German espionage thriller. Spione was released in 1928, directed by Fritz Lang and co-written with his wife Thea von Harbu, who also wrote the original novel version. Earlier spy stories often portrayed intelligence work as romantic escapism. Heroes traveled across Europe solving puzzles, uncovering conspiracies, and defeating exaggerated villains. The stakes were dramatic, but the tone was frequently light. Danger existed, but rarely felt intimate. Fleming disrupted this model. He understood that the Cold War had changed public perception. Espionage was no longer distant fiction, it was daily news. Double agents appeared in headlines. Nuclear fear shaped political reality. Governments operated in secrecy. Audiences were ready for something darker. From Russia with Love delivered exactly that. Realism as tension. One of the most important contributions of this story is its embrace of realism. Not documentary realism, but emotional realism. Bond does not save the world here, he survives a trap. The stakes are personal rather than global. The villain's plan relies on psychology rather than technology. And the action feels confined, physical, intimate. This shift influenced an entire generation of writers and filmmakers. The idea that tension could arise from proximity, from two people trapped in a room, a train compartment, a conversation, reshaped the genre. Instead of escalating spectacle endlessly, creators began exploring the power of restraint. The Bond template, human, fallible, dangerous. Before this story, the archetype of the spy hero leaned toward competence bordering on perfection. After From Russia with Love, vulnerability became essential. Bond bleeds. Bond makes mistakes. Bond survives through adaptability rather than invincibility. This humanization allowed audiences to connect emotionally with the character while still admiring his skill. And this balance becomes the foundation for modern espionage storytelling. Influence on future cinema. You can trace the DNA of From Russia with Love through decades of film history. The claustrophobic realism of the train fight echoes in later works that emphasize physical struggle over spectacle. Modern franchises such as The Bourne Identity embrace similar principles: grounded violence, psychological conflict, and a protagonist who must constantly adapt to survive. Even series known for elaborate action, like Mission Impossible, frequently return to quieter moments of tension that reflect the influence of this story's pacing. Filmmakers realize that audiences do not always need larger explosions. Sometimes they need smaller spaces, closer danger, and emotional stakes that feel immediate. The balance between realism and myth. Another reason From Russia with Love remains influential is its balance between grounded storytelling and mythic appeal. Bond is believable, but still larger than life. The world feels authentic, but still heightened. This combination allows audiences to experience fantasy while remaining emotionally invested in the outcome. Later, Bond films would sometimes lean more heavily into spectacle, gadgets, larger-than-life villains, global stakes. But many filmmakers and fans continue to return to From Russia with Love as the purest expression of Bond's core identity. Cold War paranoia as narrative fuel. The story also captures something essential about the psychological atmosphere of the Cold War paranoia: uncertainty, the sense that danger might arrive quietly rather than explosively. This atmosphere influenced not only Bond films but an entire wave of espionage cinema in the 1960s and beyond. Stories began exploring betrayal, double identities, moral ambiguity, themes that From Russia with Love presents with remarkable subtlety. The enemy is not always obvious, the threat is not always loud, and survival often depends on understanding human behavior rather than overpowering it. Why many consider it the perfect Bond? Among longtime fans and critics, From Russia with Love is often described as the perfect Bond story, not because it is the largest or most spectacular, but because it captures balance. Bond is dangerous but human, the stakes are serious but intimate, the story moves with patience, allowing tension to build gradually rather than rushing towards spectacle. It represents Bond before the myth became too large, before lasers, space stations, and world-ending devices. It shows Bond as a spy first and legend second. Transition. The legacy continues. But perhaps the greatest legacy of From Russia with Love is not what it achieved in its own time, but what it allowed the franchise to become. Its success gave filmmakers permission to expand, to experiment, to push Bond into new territories, and as the series moved forward, balancing realism and fantasy became the central challenge, one that continues to define Bond even today. Part 9. Why From Russia with Love still feels modern, the secret enduring power of realistic Bond. Decades have passed since From Russia with Love first appeared. The Cold War has ended. Technology has transformed espionage. Audiences have watched countless spy stories rise and fall. And yet, this particular Bond story continues to feel strangely contemporary. Not nostalgic, not outdated, but modern. To understand why, we need to look beyond gadgets or action scenes and instead examine something deeper, the psychology of the story. Because From Russia with Love succeeds not through spectacle, but through human truth. The human scale of danger. Many later Bond stories raise the stakes to global catastrophe, nuclear warheads, space-based weapons, world domination plots. But From Russia with Love operates on a smaller scale. The mission is personal, the threat is intimate, and this makes it timeless. Modern audiences are often more affected by stories where danger feels immediate and relatable rather than abstract. A fight in a confined train compartment can feel more intense than an exploding city because it allows viewers to imagine themselves inside the moment. The story understands that tension does not come from scale alone, it comes from proximity. Bond as professional, not superhero. Another reason the story feels modern is its portrayal of Bond as a working professional rather than an invincible icon. He makes decisions based on training, he evaluates risk, he relies on observation rather than technological superiority, and crucially, he can be wrong. This aligns closely with modern storytelling trends, where audiences prefer flawed protagonists. Later cinematic heroes such as Jason Bourne or contemporary interpretations of espionage agents owe a clear debt to this version of Bond, a character defined not by perfection but by resilience. Psychological warfare over physical power. At its core, From Russia with Love is about manipulation. The enemy does not attempt to overpower Bond through brute force. They study him, profile him, exploit his emotional tendencies. This emphasis on psychological warfare feels incredibly contemporary in an era where intelligence conflicts often revolve around information, perception, and influence rather than direct confrontation. Fleming anticipated a shift in how audiences perceive danger. The greatest threat is not always visible. Sometimes it is hidden within trust itself. The complexity of Tatiana Romanova. Modern audiences also respond strongly to Tatiana's portrayal. Unlike many early Bond women who were written primarily as romantic or sexual archetypes, Tatiana exists within a web of political and emotional pressures. She is manipulated by institutions. She believes in her own fantasy of escape, and she becomes both participant and victim in a larger game. This complexity resonates today because audiences increasingly value characters shaped by circumstance rather than simple roles. Tatiana is not simply a reward for the hero, she is a person navigating survival. Cold War paranoia and modern uncertainty. Although the geopolitical landscape has changed, the emotional reality of the Cold War, distrust, hidden agendas, invisible enemies, remains relevant. Modern espionage may involve cyber warfare and digital surveillance rather than physical decoding machines, but the underlying fear is the same. You cannot always see who is watching, you cannot always know who is telling the truth, and systems often operate beyond individual control. From Russia with Love captures that psychological environment with remarkable clarity. It shows a world where alliances feel fragile and where victory never feels absolute. Restraint as storytelling power. Another reason the story endures is its restraint. Modern filmmaking often recognizes that tension builds through silence as much as action. The pauses between dialogue, the quiet observation of surroundings, the slow approach to inevitable confrontation. These techniques feel contemporary because they align with how modern thrillers create atmosphere. Instead of overwhelming the audience, the story invites them to lean forward, to watch closely, to listen carefully. The loss of invincibility. Perhaps the most important reason From Russia with Love feels modern lies in its willingness to challenge myth. Bond nearly dies, not in a heroic blaze, but through deception, poison, vulnerability. This removal of invincibility resonates deeply with modern audiences who expect heroes to face genuine consequences. The story acknowledges that survival is fragile, and that acknowledgement transforms Bond from symbol into human being. A story that ages with its audience. As viewers grow older, they often reinterpret stories differently. What once felt exciting may begin to feel naive. But From Russia with Love ages well because its core themes remain relevant. Trust and betrayal, professionalism versus humanity, the cost of living in a world defined by secrecy. These themes do not belong to a specific era. They belong to human experience itself. transition toward final reflection. And perhaps that is the ultimate secret of this story's endurance. It does not rely on the novelty of technology or spectacle. It relies on character, on atmosphere, on tension that arises from understanding how fragile certainty really is. And that leads us to the final question. What does From Russia with Love ultimately reveal about James Bond, not just as a spy, but as a myth that continues to evolve? Finale, the last word on From Russia with Love, why this story defines James Bond. At the end of From Russia with Love, something unusual happens. The train stops, the journey ends, the mission appears complete, and yet nothing feels entirely resolved. Because this story leaves us not with triumph, but with reflection, and perhaps that is why it remains one of the most powerful entries in the Bond canon. It does not celebrate invincibility, it questions it. The moment Bond became human. Before this story, James Bond could still be seen as a fantasy, a man who moved through danger untouched, who navigated risk with effortless charm. But here something breaks. Bond bleeds, Bond doubts, Bond nearly dies, and in doing so, he becomes real. This transformation is subtle but essential. Fleming strips away just enough myth to reveal the human underneath, a professional shaped by duty, isolation, and survival instinct. We see Bond not as a symbol of victory, but as a man enduring a world that constantly seeks to erase him. The cost of survival. One of the quiet truths at the heart of From Russia with Love is that victory does not look like celebration. It looks like exhaustion. The fight on the train is not glorious. The romance is complicated. The ending is poisoned. Literally and metaphorically, Bond survives, but survival comes with weight. He carries memories, losses, the understanding that every mission leaves something behind. And this realism elevates the story beyond simple adventure. It becomes a meditation on what it means to live in constant conflict. The balance between man and myth. Over the decades, Bond would evolve. He would become larger than life, surrounded by gadgets, spectacle, and cinematic excess. But every version of Bond, no matter how grand, traces its emotional DNA back to From Russia with Love. Because this story establishes the balance that defines Bond forever. He is myth, but he must remain human. He is skilled, but never safe. He is confident, but never certain. And whenever the franchise drifts too far into fantasy, audiences instinctively look back to this story as a reminder of who Bond truly is. Why we keep returning. So why does From Russia with Love endure? Because it understands tension better than spectacle, because it respects silence as much as action, because it recognizes that the most dangerous battles happen in confined spaces, not just physical compartments on a train, but emotional spaces where trust and betrayal collide. It is a story about being watched, about being analyzed, about walking forward even when you suspect the path has already been chosen for you. And that feeling and that uncertainty is timeless. The train continues. Imagine the final image, a train moving through the night, lights flickering in distant compartments, passengers unaware of the battle that has just taken place a few doors away. Bond sits quietly, the mission complete, the danger past, for now. Outside, the world continues. Inside, he prepares for the next assignment. Because for James Bond, there is no final destination, only the next journey, the next risk, the next moment where survival depends not on strength alone, but on instinct, on observation, on the ability to endure. Final sign-off. And that is From Russia with Love, not just a Bond story, but the moment James Bond became real. A story where espionage feels personal, where victory is uncertain, and where the myth of 007 reveals the man beneath the legend. Until next time, stay observant, and remember, the most dangerous enemies are rarely the loudest. Sometimes they're already sitting beside you. We hope you enjoyed this deep dive into From Russia with Love. Please leave your comments below, like and subscribe for more. You have been listening to Zain of Zain's 007 Fancast, and this podcast was written and edited by Wilshire Eckerslike.